Greetings and welcome to the Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. I'm Phyllis Hollis, your host. As an extension of my Instagram page, Cerebral Women, this podcast offers insights into the visual art world. I interview artists, mainly artists of color and female artists who will freely articulate what inspires their creativity. In addition, you'll hear interesting perspectives from dedicated art professionals who work with artists and the art institutions that feature them. I'm confident that collectively, these individuals will indeed stimulate your mind as they do our eyes. Please know these interviews are conducted in my Manhattan apartment, so please forgive the background sounds of city life. Welcome to the Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. This episode features Alicia Knock, head curator in the Contemporary Creation and Prospective department at Centre Pompidou in Paris, France. She strives to use acquisitions and exhibitions to present a transnational history of art in the museum, focused on the global South at large. Her aim is for this history to reflect the geographical spaces traversed by the artists, as well as the traversals themselves, taking Paris as a recurring point of anchorage and transit. Alicia is interested in artistic practices that revolve around resistance and political emancipation in relation to colonial and post-colonial history and to unwritten or overlooked narratives. Committed to chronicling a pan-African history of art, starting from the advent of independence in the nations of the continent, she continues her past several years of research on the Black Atlantic through an investigation of artistic trajectories between Black America, the Caribbean, France, and Africa. Opening March 18th at the Centre Pompidou, her exhibition titled Black Paris features 150 Black artists from America, the Caribbean, and Africa who lived and worked in France between the 1950s and 2000s. Please visit cerebralwomen.com for Alicia Knock's extended bio and enjoy our conversation. Alicia, welcome to my Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. I'm excited to feature you.
Thank you, Phyllis. I'm excited to be here with you.
When in your life did you recognize your interest in visual arts?
It came quite early on. I was lucky enough to be quite creative as a kid, and I would draw a lot, and kind of somehow cannot even really recall my first visit to a museum because it felt like museums were like home to me. What I do remember is the feeling of being really safe in a museum, that it felt really comfortable to me, and even though it felt also very strange, and I love that strangeness about it. And also, I do remember something very strongly. I do remember my mom bringing a catalog of Jean-Michel Basquiat's works, and I was drawing a lot, and then I got completely obsessed. Started drawing a lot of Basquiat-influenced portraits and even self-portraits. Yeah, that's a very, very strong and vivid memory to me.
And what inspired you to actually study art?
So the French system is quite specific. So somehow when I decided to study art, it was a bit later in my studies. I had already studied like philosophy, literature in this prep school that France kind of offers, and which is the system of like you have to take an exam. So France is very exam oriented. So somehow I was already doing this kind of literary studies. And at some point I realized I wanted to be a museum curator. And in France, you have to take an exam to become a museum curator. You have to become a civil servant. So I'm a national heritage curator. So when I decided to study art, I decided to study art because I wanted to become a curator and to pass this exam. So it was already somehow quite directly oriented to my life path. So that was already the idea for me was to work in a museum, and that's how I decided to study art history. I think in another life, maybe I would have studied art, and maybe I would have become an artist. But somehow I feel like I'm a creative curator in some ways.
And I'm curious, back then, Was there a particular art movement that you really favored?
I mean, while I was studying, no, because the French exam to become a curator is you have to really swallow art history at large. And so I could not really focus on anything. But what became somehow my deep interest is really the liberation, the Pan-African modernism. So the modernist movements around the liberation time in Africa. And that's really fascinating to me because most of these movements are embedded in kind of Western modernism in some ways, but they're also reclaiming local and indigenous vernacular forms and materials and ideas and philosophies. So they are very complex images, mostly paintings that are very hard to read, very like really layered. And so this is really incredibly fascinating to me. I can mention, for example, the Nigerian artists from the Zaria Rebels, which is the first collective that was created in Nigeria ahead of independence time at the end of the 50s in northern Nigeria. Someone like Demas Noko, who is an artist that I was lucky enough to meet and to visit. He's someone who has been instrumental and who has inspired me a lot. He actually studied art. He studied theater in France in 1961 and then decided to go back to Ibadan and to pioneer architecture and to build this incredible theater and to create this new culture movement along with other artists that would become this kind of total experiment, and that he would touch upon every single material. He's a painter, a sculptor, an architect, and there was this idea of also kind of founding a new philosophy for Nigerian art, and it was also part of this broader, bigger Pan-African movement and idea. And so it also included creating a review, a very important review called New Culture. And I'm lucky enough to have some copies of that. When I visited him in the Delta State, I could buy them. Yeah, so those artists to me are really incredible because they were very radical experimenters, and at the same time they were dedicated to shift their society and to somehow to create forms of art that are revolutionary and that are really kind of also dedicated and committed to social change.
What do you enjoy most in your curatorial role?
Well, I feel extremely lucky to be doing this job, and I feel extremely lucky because it allows me to meet the most extraordinary artists, thinkers, philosophers. I'm quite international in my research, and I love field work, so I've traveled a lot extensively, especially on the continent, and everywhere I go, even when I stay sometimes only for a few days, which is always very frustrating, but already great. I'm always able to meet the most extraordinary artists, across generations. This is such a treat. I can't even describe it. It's really extraordinary. And then being able to move around, to meet people across time and space, then it really allows me to connect people. And that's the second thing that I really love about my work. And after, traveling so much, in the last 10 years, being able to connect people that, should have met in 1,000 places that sometimes they come from the same place, but somehow they never met, and being able to connect people and to create those, I call them constellations or families. I do feel like I'm some kind of astronomer sometimes, and that I'm able to connect people through my work, and this extraordinary privilege of being able to move around, because it's not a given. And I work with a lot of artists, especially in Africa, that are not able to move around the way I can. So I also feel it's some kind of a responsibility. And that's probably also quite important in my role, that I feel a lot of responsibility to what I'm doing and the way I'm doing it.
So on that note, what type of relationship do you like to have with artists?
I live with artists. I'm quite dedicated to the process and the research around how an artwork is being created. So I'm fascinated with the process itself, understanding where an idea comes from and how it can expand and transform. I like to be part of the process. I like to have very long and dynamic conversations with artists. I also feel like I want to work long term with artists, so I wouldn't be able to include, an artist in a show and then, not follow up. I'm really interested in these kind of lifetime conversations. That's why meeting artists and spending a lot of time with them, and somehow it's not so much doing studio visits. I really spend a lot of time outside of the studio. I like also artists that are research driven, that are also quite politically active, and that are also dedicated to collective thinking, to collaborating. So it's often through gatherings that we spend a lot of time together and try and see how we can expand, the work, make it stronger, connecting practices together. So, for example, I was lucky enough to co-curate 3 biennials last year in Eastern Europe that were looking at this non-aligned solidarity between Africa and Eastern Europe that originated in the 60s when there was this, of course, the Eastern Europe also supported the liberation of Africa. And so 500,000 students from USSR were trained, from Africa were trained in USSR, for example. And so with my co-curator Inga Leys from Latvia, we invited artists coming from Africa, coming from Eastern Europe, and we tried to really connect, create a new transnational family. So there would be amazing artists, from Angola, such as Yonamin, or Lithuania and Armenia, such as Andrius Arutinian, and artists from Czech Republic, from Slovakia, from Zimbabwe, and we created this kind of creative family across space, trying to revive what it would mean to kind of revive this solidarity today. How to engage with history and how to revive history and bring it to the present in a dynamic and creative way.
What do you see as the greatest challenges that artists are facing today?
Yeah, so it really depends also where we're speaking from. Artists that are based in Africa, and they're facing very specific challenges that are very different from, an artist based in Paris or New York. I mean, for artists that are based on the continent, obviously there's no infrastructure for art. There are very few museums, there are very few private foundations, there are very few galleries. So it is a very challenging reality. Just being able to create art is already something that they have to fight for. And then in the West, or in Paris, for example, or in the Western context, I guess, at large, probably it's really hard. I would say today, in general, in the art world, even me as a curator, it's really hard to find a path where you can find a balance between, the art market and what the art market requires, and also the politics and how politics are also sometimes limiting, the content that can be made. So how can you sustain a research? I work with a lot of artists that are research driven, that are politically vocal and active. So obviously creating a path that is avoiding the market and avoiding this kind of imposed politics that are often now far-right politics that we are experiencing kind of both sides of the Atlantic. It's a very difficult thing. So I would say that being able to sustain a research that is still, quite ethic and free is definitely difficult.
Do you feel Black art can be defined?
I mean, historically, Black art has been defined. There's a history of Black art that is connected also to politics around the civil rights movement, for example. And there is a history of also Pan-African art and how Black artists have been, fighting for freedom and have used their art for emancipation and liberation. So there is a contained history of Black art officially. And then it covers obviously a lot of different realities, a lot of different practices, but obviously there is a common thread, which is that there is a space, there is the Black Atlantic that is kind of connecting, artists together. And that's the result of the history of colonialism and slavery. So there is a Black space that spans from Africa to the Americas. So that's quite obvious. And then there's also a common thread, which is, Black artists have been facing oppression and racism on a daily basis. So I think that this is something that, has to be acknowledged and that has impacted, their work conditions. And that's something that has to be acknowledged and analyzed and embraced.
So what do you feel is the purpose of art?
Well, I think art can really change the world. And I think art is a political and social weapon because art is probably one of the only spaces in life that kind of brings people together and creates dialogue. And that's the dialogue that I feel we're missing in our societies right now. And that's why it's so difficult for us to be together today. I think art plays an essential role in this way. I think artists are political in a very radical way, and they're able to experiment social ideas that politicians could never experiment with.
What do you feel is the role of the artist?
I think an artist has an ability to play with time and space and to create narratives, to kind of bring narratives and ideas together beyond language that kind of creates real conversations, real community, and the possibility of a dialogue that is coming from understanding very specific contexts, very specific, like a lot of differences, and out of those differences, articulating a path of commonality.
And what do you feel is the role of the art patron, the collector?
Well, again, if I look at the role of a collector or a patron, in Africa where infrastructure is lacking, art patrons can play the role of an institution, supporting the artists, allowing them to continue. So it's a very instrumental role. And I know patrons and collectors, for example, in Senegal, that have put together collections that probably will become, the collection of almost a museum collection, bringing together art history for West Africa and making that legible for, hopefully in the future, for a broader audience. But I would say when I see how artists and collectors how close they can be, it's a very important support for the artists, to have people following their work, supporting them in a very dynamic and quick way. Because institutions, and I can speak from that perspective, institutions are very slow and sometimes very heavy to navigate. And even if I'm supporting a lot of artists, sometimes my institution, it takes a decade for my institution to do something about it, or to buy something, or to give some production fee or whatever. And I think patrons and collectors have that very quick, way of supporting. And without their support, artists could not continue.
So share with us, let's talk about this fabulous, very important exhibition that you are working on. What are you excited about right now?
Yes, I'm very excited to be able to open the last exhibition of the Centre Pompidou before we undergo a big renovation. And this is the Black Paris, the Paris Noir exhibition, opening on the 18th of March, and it will run until the end of June. And it will include 150 artists across the Black Atlantic, so African-American artists, African artists, Caribbean artists, and Black French artists also born in France. And it's kind of an incredible show because it will bring together all these different perspectives, and is spanning 50 years of history from the end of the 40s and the creation of Présence Africaine, this extraordinary publishing house that also became a gathering point for artists and intellectuals, until the end of the 90s, where Revue Noire, also a very important Black review, was being published. That would become a very important archive for African contemporary art. And it obviously is covering this post-colonial moment. So it is featuring or articulating Paris as an anti-colonial, a Pan-African lab, which is an extraordinary story that has been told everywhere in the world, especially in the US. Paris has been a very important Black city, or like the international Black capital in the 20th century. But somehow, this extraordinary, glorious history where we all know that at the end of the 40s, when the show starts, Baldwin has just arrived and Edouard Glissant is also in Paris, and the Negritude movement is happening around Léopold Sédar Senghor and Suzanne and Aimé Césaire and Léon Gontran Damas. And at the same time, somehow it was never celebrated in Paris in a national institution like the Pompidou. So it is a very important moment, and the show is trying to map, how massive this history is. It's going to be a radically political show, but it also is going to be a radical show in terms of art history, showing, how artists obviously kind of contributed to the history of negritude and the aesthetics of negritude and Pan-African movements, art movements. But it will also feature a lot of artists that came to Paris and that kind of cracked the canon of modernism and postmodernism, reframed our understanding of surrealism, of abstraction from the 50s to the 80s. And so it's going to be really mind-blowing in this way, just being able to uncover all these extraordinary works and bring them together, bring this idea of, also Black artists being part of an international movement, such as bringing together Africa, the Caribbean, and the US from the lens of Paris, which is another very international site. So I hope the show will be really empowering. I also hope that the show inspires a lot of students, a lot of scholars, and a lot of colleagues also in museum curators and all of that in France and beyond to continue to study, these artists. Because when you look at the artists included in the show, African American artists have been celebrated, acquired, written about because of the support system that has existed for Black artists in the US for decades now, thanks to HBCUs and the scholarship that has been achieved. But when you look at French Caribbean artists or African artists, you realize that a lot of their works, a lot of their archives that are often, still in Paris, still accessible, not in great shape, often staying with families who have no support and have no, they don't really know how to deal with those archives and artworks. No support system. So there's really an urgency in saving, in writing, in collecting, and showing. And I also see the show as a program because obviously this is a massive group show and all of these extraordinary artists that have worked often for 50, 60, 70 years. So we're showing only a few works of each of them or one work. And obviously each of them deserves a solo show, a retrospective, a publication. So this is also, the show is somehow a calling for more research exhibitions, for more publications, for more acquisitions. I've been trying to use the show as an acquisition campaign. So thanks to the Friends of the Pompidou, we were able to create a Paris Noir acquisition fund through which I've been able to acquire a few very important pieces, especially by African-American artists such as Raymond Saunders, Mildred Thompson, Herb Gentry, so that's already amazing. And I've also been able to acquire and catch up with French Caribbean artists that were completely sidelined within the institutional narrative, such as René Louise and Ernest Breleur, who are very important artists from Martinique that founded this movement in the beginning of the 80s after spending time in Paris and redefining their own identity as Martinicans. Thanks to Paris, Paris triggered them to define themselves and to understand where they were coming from. And so back in Martinique in the early 80s, they created this group called Fromager, that was then showcased at Howard University thanks to the AfriCobra group that invited them at the end of the 80s at Howard. So there are a lot of these beautiful connections that the show drafts. That's something also quite fascinating. So the show is an acquisition campaign. We will continue obviously feeding this Paris Noir fund thanks to the Friends of the Pompidou, the American Friends of the Pompidou that have also been involved, the Africa Acquisition Group that I was also lucky enough to create 5 years ago. So there's a lot of these deep and profound dynamics that have been triggered by the show. And then obviously we also created a seminar in partnership with Nanterre and the National Institute of Art History here. And I'm also hoping to maybe create an educational program with Black universities in the US. And that was also, what the Villa Albertine kind of allowed me to start discussions around, how we could maybe create and sustain the research after the show ends. So the show is really meant to be this first step, this baby step. It's a massive step because it will shed light on, the work that still needs to be done, but it definitely needs to be unpacked. The show, it has to be unpacked in the next decades in the institution and beyond.
I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been very informative and interesting. And I'm so excited about your upcoming show in Paris. It's such important work. So this is the last question. And in your role, how do you want to impact the way people think?
Yeah, I do want to make an impact, especially with this Black Paris show, for example, which is the result for me of 10 years of doing research, of being on the ground, of moving around, of meeting artists from different generations and connecting spaces and countries together. I really hope this exhibition kind of has a political impact, in France right now. It is a show that is showing Paris and France as a refuge, as a place where it felt safe enough to become an artist and to be an artist, even if you were a Black artist. Yeah, so it is a very important story to tell and to unpack today. And it shows also how French society, how France kind of has hosted, very different perspectives and histories, and has been a space where a lot of artists and intellectuals gathered to think about a better world, a world where people could be equal, could live together. And I think this is giving a very important vision of what French society has been and can be. And I think we need to champion that instead of listening to a lot of biased stories about how exclusive we can be and what it is to be French. And, France has colonized a lot of countries. And the result of that is, obviously, it's a tragic history. But the result of that is also that, we are a multicultural society, and we can learn from each other, and we can self-multiply. And we could also claim that being French is being a little bit Algerian and Senegalese and Martinican, and having access to those stories and those cultures and those languages and those philosophies are really empowering. So I really hope that this show kind of shifts the narrative of how we understand and read what it is to be part of this society now. And obviously it is also about France as a multicultural place, but it's also showing how international and how cultures can come together and meet, in places like Paris, like New York, and other places now that are not considered, that are not even in the West, but showing also how transnational connections can expand our vision and our ways of being and understanding the world.
Thank you so much for the work you're doing.
Thank you, Phyllis.
Thank you for listening to Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. For additional content, please visit cerebralwomen.com and be sure to follow Cerebral Women on Instagram.